back on Quinn, naturally, but it would be much more of a problem on Heaven's River, where there was more space, fewer Quinlans, and less pressure to stay together due to a more accommodating environment. I started to compose a reply, then changed my mind. I would wait until the next time we talked. Instead, I pinged Will and received an invitation. I opened a video window and found him working with his garden about 30 feet away. I realized I was getting a video feed from a roamer. Will probably had my transmission on his heads up. "Still at it?" I said. "Yep. These plants won't breed themselves." He laughed. "Okay, they would, but I'm trying for specific adaptations." I hesitated for a moment, then blurted out, "Listen, Will, I read your blog, especially the part about a mini Bellerophon. Are you really thinking of physically heading out in it? Is it even ready?" Will stood straight and gazed in my direction for a moment with an inscrutable expression. "To be honest, I left the 82 Eridani system a year and a half ago. I'm already well on my way." I let my jaw drop. He hadn't mentioned this to anyone as far as I knew. "No, I haven't told anyone yet," he said, reading my mind. "And it doesn't really matter, does it? As a group, we're still unconsciously in the mindset that you have to be located in whatever system you're active. But with Scott, as long as you're on the network, you can be anywhere." "So you'll keep working on the Valhalla terraforming?" Will made a so-so gesture. "I want to get out of politics, so I'm going to have to be perceived as unavailable. I think I'll have to hand off this project as well. Fortunately, it's far enough along that the Asgard government can take it from here." "And you're going to do this thing with Herschel and Neil?" "Yep. And then keep going." I blew out a breath. I'm shocked and surprised, but also a little jealous. Well, I'll still be around in the Bobiverse for a long, long time, Bob. "Can you take another passenger?" Will gave me the side-eye. "Seriously?" "Not sure yet. I'll think about it." Hugh and I managed to keep to our plan for 8 days, with no glitches. But somewhere along the line, we must have slipped up somehow, or maybe we were just unlucky. It was the middle of the night, and I was off watch, sitting in my library, when I got a call from Hugh. "Bob, I think we have a problem." I popped immediately back into my Manny. "What?" To maintain silence, we continued to communicate over the intercom. 4 boats converging on us. That seems unlikely to be a coincidence. Can we dodge them? If we didn't have Bender, we could just run underwater with the box having to stay on the surface. I don't see how, especially if they have aerial support. I examined the darkness above us. Probably some kind of night flyer. That means that even if we get away, they'll be watching for this strategy in the future. True, but let's deal with the current situation right now. I took a moment to evaluate the 4 approaching boats. We might be able to sow some confusion with this many pursuers. Hugh did his own survey, then added, "We could also use the Millennium Falcon maneuver. We'd need a distraction. I can handle that. I'll take the box, you take Bender. I've already got my spiders cutting open the case. You'll have to submerge Bender at least for a few moments. I sure hope the vellum is watertight." "Me too, but I don't think we have a choice. I can also stuff the Matrix into your pack just for a little additional safety." I nodded just as the cover on the shipping case released with a slight pop. Hugh rummaged in the box while I held it steady. The boats grew steadily closer, but they were still too far away to see us. I was sure they were navigating by dead reckoning and instructions from someone. I still couldn't see anything in the air above us. Hopefully the surveillance was too high to see clearly what we were doing, and once Hugh was submerged, he would be invisible. Hugh disappeared under the waves with hardly a ripple, leaving me with the transport case. I jammed the lid back on and began to noisily swim away, sacrificing everything for speed. I wasn't going to do a straight run, though. I wanted to create as much confusion as I could and keep their attention on me. Accordingly, I turned between ships again and again, trying to lead them into each other. We played a kind of warped game of tag for almost a minute before our pursuers did the obvious thing. A number of splashes indicated that Quinlans were going into the water to take me down. "You set?" "Set," Hugh replied. "Go." Abandoning my prior strategy, I undertook a straight-line retreat, making for the nearest shoreline as fast as I could manage. With the case balanced on my stomach, I was at a disadvantage. On the other hand, I was normally able to swim twice as fast as a biological Quinlan. It was close, but I made it to shore with a lead measured in seconds. The boats had to heave, too, rather than run aground, but I could hear individual Quinlans hopping onto land just behind me. Now it was a foot race, and I was forced to run upright while my pursuers could go down on all fours. But again, it was biological versus machine. It would come down to who overheated first. Here, though, I had another advantage: night vision. It was still dark, and although they might be able to track me from the air, they certainly couldn't pursue me at full speed. In 2 minutes, I was into the trees. I was well ahead of my pursuers, and there was no way they'd find me in the dark, at least not without help. And that help would now have to come into the trees to find me. I cast around hurriedly for a rock, but in this artificial environment, random loose rocks would be few and far between. Nothing else presented itself. A piece of wood wouldn't do unless it was in the form of a spear. Then I had an idea. I quickly spit up an iron piece, about the size of a silver dollar but twice as heavy. It would make an excellent missile in the right movement above. A shadow resolved itself into a bird about the size of a crow. It had landed on a branch and was moving through the tree, trying to get farther into the copse without flying blind. I measured the distance, cocked an arm, and let fly. Computer senses combined with machinery capable of supplying a force with milligram precision put the iron piece right through the chest of the spy device. The bird went over backward without a squawk and landed with a thump. I spared a moment to verify what I already knew. It had spilled gears and electronics rather than blood and guts. I had to move fast. If they had another spy drone in reserve, it would try to take up the search from the last known position, which was here. I picked up the case and ran farther into the forest. "How's it going, Hugh?" "Good. I'm attached to the underside of one of the catamaran hulls above the waterline. Bender seems okay. At least the flea in the backpack hasn't reported any moisture. No one has come looking, so either they didn't realize there were two of us, or they only care about the one with the case. I'm hoping it's the former. You stay put until you can get off without being spotted. Then I'll meet up. Meanwhile, I need to figure out how to ditch this case without them finding it. As long as they're looking for a Quinlan with a transport case, they won't be looking for a Quinlan with a big cubicle backpack or a Quinlan with no backpack." "My backpack is in the box," Hugh said. "I left it there when I grabbed yours, and now you have all my money." "Ah, gotcha." I opened the box, and sure enough, there was a backpack in it. Compared to the weight of a Matrix, that had been negligible. I donned the pack, then closed the case and inspected the area. Some fallen trees could be the beginning of a windfall. Not enough to hide a box, but maybe enough to disguise some digging. I quickly pawed open a hole in the ground. Fortunately, I didn't hit shell material before the hole was deep enough and dropped the case in. I shoved some of the dirt pile over the case, and the hole was filled in. I took a few minutes to spread the extra soil around and scatter leaves and moss on the spot. It wasn't perfect, but I didn't need perfect. I just needed good enough. Until they found the box, my pursuers would assume they were looking for a Quinlan carrying a packing crate that contained the magical cube that the Administrator and the Resistance wanted so badly. Once they discovered the empty container, they'd be back to looking for a Quinlan with a bulky backpack, which would put Hugh back in their sights. For the moment, though, I was just another random traveler. I modified my appearance, almost out of habit, then set off westward, the opposite direction to what they'd be expecting. 2 hours later, with the dawn breaking, I was back in the water and driving flat out to the east. "How are you holding up, Hugh?" "Okay. No one seems to have thought to look under the boat. I don't think they're really looking for a second fugitive. And the boats are sailing downstream, so I'll stick with them until they change their headings." "Yeah, I figure they're concentrating their efforts on tracking me. Meanwhile, I'm coming up behind you. Are all the boats still together? And can you get a fix on the sun? Your current sun angle will tell me where you are. Sorry, Bob, I don't think I can leave my spot without exposing myself. Keep looking for the boats and otherwise just head downstream. Right now, I'm going where we want to go anyway. I sighed and signed off. The probability that Hugh's ride would conveniently keep going east into the Garrick's spine segment was vanishingly small, which meant we'd be winging it again at some point. There had to be some way of getting the Matrix to our destination, other than the ones we'd already tried. The safest transport method for Bender would still be as cargo, either mail or as part of a shipment, but they were inspecting all containers. And all boats, as Will had pointed out, so we couldn't... Well, hold on. Would they inspect their own boats? Would they expect me to have the nerve to hitch a ride with them? It might be that Hugh was in the safest possible place right now. 24. Negotiations. Bill, September 2334, Vert.
You have a communications request from Lenny.
Seriously? I could feel my jaw drop. We were winning the war against Starfleet, so maybe... No, winning was the wrong word. We were pushing them back, but in the process, humanity was destroying our assets. Like taking out not yet necrotic tissue as part of an amputation. I grimaced at the comparison. That was dark for me. Guppy, of course, had treated my expostulation like he did any non-procedural statement. Total ignore. He stood at parade rest, patiently waiting for me to say something actionable. Fine, Guppy, let him in, but firewall him.
Communication is audio-visual only.
Oh, okay. A window popped up with Lenny standing squarely in the middle of it. Lenny? Bill? I tolerated the stare-off for less than half a mil before my impatience got the better of me. You wanted this palaver, Lenny, out with it. He nodded and briefly examined his shoes or something. We're winning this war, Bill. Time to discuss terms. Unbelievable. What drugs are you on? Or have you invented a new definition of winning that means getting your asses kicked? He smirked. Our intention isn't and has never been to take over stellar systems. Geez, Bill, we want to sever contact with the bios, not end up in charge. Instead, we're forcing you and the humans to destroy equipment in order to quarantine us, but it quarantines you at the same time, so it's a win for us. Uh-huh. That sounds like redefining winning to me. What you're doing is inconveniencing us for a year or two. Is that a win for you? You're just looking at short-term damage, Bill. What makes you think things will go back to same old after this is over? So why are you negotiating, Lenny? Seems to me if you have the upper hand, this conversation doesn't make sense. Lenny looked down at his shoes again and sighed. I know you and the others don't consider us to be Bobs anymore. I don't think you're entirely wrong for what it's worth, but you've reduced it to a false dichotomy. Either all Bob or no Bob. He gazed silently at me for a moment, perhaps gauging my reaction. We're no more in love with blowing up things and endangering people than you are, but you know as well as I do that you've done exactly that when you felt the cause justified it. Believe me, this is the less destructive option. Less destructive than what? Lenny opened his mouth a couple of times, trying to find the right words. Our first plan would have caused more damage overall. Let's just leave it at that, okay? Lenny, what's causing this? Why are you so set on the Prime Directive? Don't bother psychoanalyzing me or us. Regardless of why, it's how we see things. And to answer the obvious next question, this isn't a live and let live situation. Your insistence on continuing to be Budinskis affects the rest of the Bobiverse, including us. How exactly? Right this very minute, not a lot, but the Bobiverse is effectively monolithic, at least viewed from the outside. Something goes bad, it'll paint all of us. Just like this war is painting you from the human's point of view. I began to get a glimmer. So this isn't so much about preventing damage to bios, but more about protecting Vert? Lenny bobbed his head back and forth. The two are not mutually exclusive, but yes, basically. Do you have anything specific in mind? For existential threats to the Bobiverse, I mean. For the first time, I saw real emotion on Lenny's face. Only for a split mill, but I'd swear it was naked fear. Then he recovered control and donned the neutral expression typical of poker play. Lenny? No comment, Bill. You'll have to take my word for it. There are worse things that could happen than a few blown-up comms stations. Not good enough. Sorry. Surely there's enough Bob still in you to know that take my word for it doesn't go very far. Lenny gave me a flash of a smile, a wan, sad fraction of a grin. Don't call me Shirley. And yeah, I know, but he shook his head. Sorry, some things just aren't for public consumption. So, it looks like we continue with this. You'll win, of course, in that you and the bios will eventually kick us off all the common resources, but I think we'll have achieved our purpose. Bye, Bill. And with that, the window disappeared, but the feeling in the pit of my stomach remained. This was more than just some random obsession engendered by replicative drift. What the hell had happened to them? 25. Crossover. Bob. September 2334, Nirvana River System. 6 days later, we were in the Garrick segment. I'd caught up with Hugh, and both of our mannies were wedged up under the hull of one of the crew boats. I sat in my lazy boy while Hugh lay flopped in the beanbag chair. We've been surprisingly lucky the last week, Hugh said. But now we have to use the transfer river to get over to the Arcadia. They know we're on the Nirvana, or at least we were recently. They know we are, or at least might be heading for Garrick's Spine, thanks to me labeling the box at one point. Brilliant move. 2020 hindsight is, Hugh said with a shrug. And anyway, I think the reason these boats came here is specifically because they know our destination and are setting up blockades. And we got a free ride out of it, so it's not all downside. Except for the part about them setting up a blockade. No plan is perfect. Hugh thought for a moment. Overland? 90-odd miles of hiking? With no guarantee they aren't watching for that as well? No thanks. We have a better chance in the water. Okay. If we're going to be going the watery route, let's stop in the last town and beef up our waterproofing. A couple more layers of vellum, maybe an extra coat of waterproofing on the inside of your backpack. Check the seams. Stuff like that. I nodded. Sounds good. And as long as one of us stays with the Matrix out of town, it's a low-risk activity. They can't be vetting every single purchase in town, even if they had reason to believe this might be a concern for us. Hugh twitched, but didn't respond. By this point, our mutual avoidance of the subject that shall not be uttered was well established, but I could see he didn't entirely agree. Getting to town wasn't a huge problem. The crew boats anchored just outside of the last town before the transfer tributary. We waited for dark, then dropped off the underside of the boat and sculled silently to shore, just upstream of the docks. I didn't want us to be seen going into town, as it was virtually certain there would be surveillance. We found some dense trees and climbed up into the foliage until we were out of sight. Hugh did a quick inspection of the backpack and Matrix. All good, although the backpack is definitely showing the strain. Some pitch on the inside will help a lot with that, though. I nodded and reviewed the list Hugh had given me. While it would have made more sense for Hugh to go shopping for those items, I was far more experienced with the tactics that crew and the Resistance were using, and would be at least a little more likely to detect them. I wandered into town, casual and carefree, and ambled about for an hour, projecting nothing to see here from every follicle. Crew didn't wear any kind of special uniform, of course, but there did appear to be a lot of Quinlans standing around looking alert. I received several concentrated once-overs as well, but new face, generic backpack, and no large cubicle cargo meant they lost interest quickly. I found the correct store, per Hugh's instructions, but a glance at the two large alert Quinlans hanging around the entrance convinced me to walk on by. So they had made the connection. Or someone had. "The store is being watched," I said over the intercom. "I guess I was half expecting that," Hugh replied. "We'll have to think of something else. Break in after dark? I think that would raise a big ol' red flag. Weather-sealing supplies aren't generally high on the smash-and-grab list." I frowned in thought, watching the store out of the corner of my eye. I wonder how dedicated those guys are. Do they show up first thing in the morning and stay until close? Good question. I guess you'll have to do a stakeout. I went into a nearby shop and asked casually what time they normally closed. It was a reasonable assumption that everyone would have more or less the same schedule. I had a few hours to kill, so I decided to spend it walking around and getting the lay of the land. I was back just before closing. The last customer walked out of the supply shop, and I could see through the window the proprietor starting to put things away. The two large loiterers glanced at each other, shrugged, and walked off. Perfect. As soon as they were around a corner, I rushed into the shop, gasping for breath. "Made it," I said. "I thought I was going to be too late." The proprietor was more amused than anything else, fortunately. I've had too much experience with sales critters who won't even talk to you 1 second after closing, but then those were staff, not the owners of the business.
"What can I help you with?"
he said. I gave him a list, and he happily produced the items. A quick exchange of coinage, and I was out the door. "Got the goods, heading back." "You're a real felon," Hugh replied with a chuckle. As we worked on the backpack and Matrix, we discussed our options. "They can't set up a blockade on the transfer tributary," Hugh said. "At least not once it gets rough. You can't maintain station, and you certainly can't stop boats and inspect them in that kind of water." "So, a hike overland, then into the water just past whatever checkpoint they've set up. Sounds like a great idea," I said, and Hugh beamed. "Just like getting the weatherproofing supplies did." His face fell. I continued. "I'm sure they'll think of that, so what counter-moves will they use?" "Aerial surveillance," he replied. "That's the only option I can think of." "And they can't cover 90 miles of tributary, so they'll be watching somewhere in the middle third or so," I added. "So we need to be under a boat by that point." "Wait for a catamaran to come by and climb aboard after inspection? That sounds like a good idea." "Mostly," I raised an eyebrow. "Objection?" "It's pretty rough in the changeover. I'm not sure we could hold on under the hull. And the downside of losing our grip would be significant." He was right. "Alternatives?" Hugh hesitated. "Bob, the really rough patch where the storm surge is significant is only about 10 miles long, and it's about 2/3 of the way around. Why don't we float as long as we can, then walk the bad stretch?" "A 10-mile hike?" I considered. "We wouldn't be lugging the storage box. Bender would be in the backpack. I think that'll work, as long as it's at night." We did some quick tests of the backpack in a local stream with several spiders on board to alert us of any leaks. The backpack held, but we weren't willing to push our luck by submerging to any depth. As soon as it was dark, we made our way to the river and pushed off. The transfer tributary, called the Scrubber by the locals, was less than a mile downstream. We kept close to shore, hoping that the complex shoreline and shallow water vegetation would make it difficult for any aerial observer. Or, alternatively, that they'd be watching farther out. As we approached the Scrubber, we could see that a flotilla was set up, blocking the entrance. Quickly, we went ashore and started marching directly uphill. I didn't want to just follow the shore on land, as there would almost certainly be a land-based component to the blockade. I had to trust Quinlan's dislike of long hikes to ensure that we could go around everyone. I almost miscalculated it, though. Turns out I don't like hiking either, and made the decision to turn eastward just a little too early. Only the sound of voices raised in argument stopped us before we blithely walked into a guard post. We froze, glanced at each other, then edged into the bushes. The voices rose and fell in volume and emotion. It sounded like a difference of opinion about some obscure rule of a popular dice game. The guards were apparently handling the boredom with a bit of gambling. Hugh grinned but said nothing, and we changed our heading to go farther uphill. It was two bedraggled, waterlogged, and cranky Quinlan Mannies who dragged their butts out of the water at the other end of the scrubber. I am never going in water again as long as I live, I said into the air. As a chemical substance, it is vastly overrated, Hugh agreed. Let's find a place to camp and get out of these wet Mannies. It wasn't that we were physically tired. That wasn't an issue with Mannies, but the constant running and the pounding we'd taken from even the milder stretches of river were mentally taxing. Even a post-human computer could finally have had enough. We set up a nest, made sure we were not visible, and popped back into VR. 26. Winding down. Bill, September 2334, Vert. I examined the star map in the holotank. Annotations attached to individual stellar systems indicated the current status of stations, autofactories, and public opinion. It wasn't good. A few comms stations had been recovered, but in the end most had either successfully self-destructed or been nuked, probably out of frustration. Most autofactories had been recovered, but at the expense of significant downtime. The humans had put together their own software image, which they weren't sharing with us, and installed it on all human-controlled autofactories. It appeared the divorce was all but complete. Starfleet had succeeded in their goal, after a fashion, or maybe exactly in the way they'd intended. We hadn't ceased contact with humanity, but it would be through a much more narrow interface in the future. We no longer owned or controlled any comms stations and had very few autofactories anywhere in human-controlled space. This left the Bob-controlled systems naturally, but there was precious little of that, Epsilon Eridani and Alpha Centauri being the biggest examples. I remembered that one private conversation I'd had with Lenny. I hadn't discussed it with anyone, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to. It had been disquieting, but without any kind of possible resolution. Just questions, no answers, at least not yet. I'd been doing some quiet poking around, and I had perhaps the first inklings of a possible explanation, but my ruminations were interrupted by a ping from Will. I invited him over, and he appeared a moment later. Hi, Will, what's up? You remember the suggestion from Cranston that humans should claim and garrison all systems anywhere near New Pav? Yes, I hope your question isn't as ominous as it sounds. Sorry, but yes. It's been approved by the UFS Council. They're going to start putting together expeditions to explore and claim as much as they can. It'll take a while, light speed being what it is, but I frowned. Listen, Will, how many of those systems have been visited by Bobs? Most of them. But since we've had to isolate all the comms stations from BobNet, the UFS has deemed those systems to be abandoned and therefore fair game. Oh, deemed, have they? Will we go along with that? Will grinned in reply. Funny you should ask. I've been talking to Oliver about it. He has a lot more free time than you, so I figured it would help to keep me off your back. Anyway, we can, with a little juggling, get nearby Bobs to most of those systems before the human expeditions, even if the humans were able to leave right away. And we'll instruct them to build a large and impressive military presence first thing, just in case the humans feel inclined to get pushy when they arrive. Okay, so we claim the systems. Why? At the moment, more as a blocking tactic than anything. Will shrugged. We don't, generally speaking, need the systems ourselves, but the PAV might. If we had the claim, we could sell them to the PAV for some nominal amount, saving face all around while very probably preventing escalating tensions. Huh. Not a bad idea. You and Oliver will headman this? Yeah, you seem busy enough. I laughed. You ain't wrong. How's it going? I hesitated before replying. Well, the damage to human-replicant relations is pretty significant and probably long-term. And I guess Starfleet will consider that a victory. A lot of hardware has been taken down to get Starfleet out of our systems. The bad news being that we're taking them down. Yep, lots of rebuilding in our future, or in the humans' future. I don't get the impression we'll be invited to help. Peachy, Will stood. Off to my next date from hell. Have fun. Yeah, that's what it is. 27. We've arrived. Bob, September 2334, Arcadia River System. The trip down the Arcadia was relatively uneventful. I attributed that partly to our extreme level of caution, and partly to the administrator's inability to cover absolutely everything. Our biggest danger at this point, other than being spotted, would be a very human tendency to throw caution to the wind and break into a sprint as we approached the finish line. Accordingly, we made a point of moving conservatively, staying close to shore and only traveling in the darkest part of the night. And eventually, we reached a familiar stretch of the river. We made our way to the shore and came up with a plan. We'd hike in closer to Garrick's spine, then wait until dark to make for the transit station. So how will we handle this? Hughes said, gesturing to the backpack. Maybe the fact that there are two of us will throw them off, I replied. Plus, I've altered my appearance. Again, you probably aren't on anyone's radar yet. Hughes said nothing but leaned around me and peered at my backpack in an exaggerated manner. I know it sticks out like a sore thumb, or like a backpack with a large cube in it. I wonder if I could pad it out, or get a bigger pack. I don't think there's any help for it, he replied. We can't hide Bender's matrix. If we're seen carrying around a box big enough to conceal it, we'll probably be questioned anyway. At least the backpack gives us more mobility. At this stage, I don't think subtlety is going to be of much benefit. The run-like-hell portion of the program? I said with a small laugh. That, and just going through at night, will be our biggest advantage. True. We have better night vision. Let's hope we don't run into Officer Friendly, though. A quick glance at the sun confirmed we would be at Garrick's spine around nightfall if we left now and took it easy. It took slightly longer than expected to get to the town, so it was full dark by the time we arrived. As I always did, I stopped to admire the stellar display. That's just awesome, I said, pointing up at the heavens. Sure is, Hugh replied. Interestingly, the constellations are accurate based on what the Quinlans would have seen from their planet. I love the attention to detail. We got our fill of the view and the few moments of zen before we crossed the city limits into the town proper. Garrick did not particularly go in for streetlights. Illumination from windows helped a little, but for the most part you'd have to bring your own light if you were moving around at night. We did, in fact, see a couple of individuals walking along, holding lanterns above their heads. We avoided them on principle. There was no upside to getting noticed. The town was quiet, as befitted a society that rose and set with the sun. Occasional lowing sounds from hounds provided the only real breaks in the silence. But a couple of times we heard furtive sounds of movement with no attendant lantern light. I wasn't interested in finding out the source. We consistently moved in the opposite direction. Then, when we were about halfway through Garrick, a series of loud, popping sounds broke the nocturnal quiet. Both Hugh and I prairie-dogged, looking around with night vision turned up to max. There was no movement except a slight fog wafting through the streets. Wait. Fog? Fog required a specific set of meteorological circumstances to form, circumstances that were even more rare in Heaven's River. And we did not have that particular set of circumstances at the moment. "I have a bad feeling," Hughes said, evidently having reached the same conclusion at the same time. We started edging toward a side street, eyeballs darting in all directions at once. The separate images still disoriented me, so I frame-jacked slightly to ensure I could closely examine each view. Then, from the shadows of the adjoining streets, came several groups of Quinlans carrying pistols and wearing what could only be gas masks. "I think we should leave," Hughes said. "You think?" I growled. "Which way? Do you see an opening?" "No, this looks very well planned. We may have to go up." I followed Hughes' gaze. A series of leaps and grabs would place us on the roof of this one-story building. I couldn't tell anything from there, even with night vision. There wasn't enough light to make out how the building connected to its neighbors. But we didn't have a lot of options. Not bothering to comment, I leaped for the first hold and began hauling myself up. I could hear Hugh following me. I could also hear the pings of flechettes bouncing off the wall. None had struck me yet, but I couldn't tell about my backpack. Would the flechettes penetrate the material? Would they harm the matrix? With a snarl, I redoubled my efforts and popped over the top of the wall. I had a few moments of peace while the shooters concentrated their fire on Hugh. A few muttered curses showed he'd been hit. I thought I saw a way up to a nearby second-floor window, but I wouldn't know for sure until I was closer. Banging from street level made it clear that our pursuers were trying to get into the building whose roof we were currently occupying. We needed to be elsewhere. It was not the time for subtlety. I hit the wall to the next building, grabbed a few handholds, then pulled myself up using the windowsill. The window was partly open, and I butted the frame upward with my head, then pulled myself in. I spared a second to admire the athleticism of the Mannies. No Quinlan or human would have managed that feat. We were further advertising our existence by doing this, but I didn't see an alternative. There was a thump as Hugh rolled in behind me. We were in a bedroom, but there didn't appear to be any occupants. I opened the door and we snuck down the hall, trying to avoid any creaky boards. This appeared to be a rooming house. The second floor consisted of nothing but bedrooms and a bathroom. We tiptoed down the stairs at the end of the hall and peered around the corner at the bottom. What I supposed must be a common room took up the back half of the ground floor. There were 4 Quinlans sitting in chairs, all apparently sleeping. It would have been quite innocent, except one of the sleepers was slumped over in a most uncomfortable manner. "I think they've been knocked out," I said. "The fog?" "Yeah. I think there's a scattering going on." "Well, I agree this is likely how they do a scattering, but I think they're after us, Bob." "We have to get out of here." There was a back door in a small antechamber. I opened it and peered both ways. Nothing. We exited, carefully closed the door, and ran across the street and around the nearest corner, right into a group of mask-wearing Quinlans. We barreled into the group before we could stop or change direction. After that, it was just a matter of them getting their hands on us and holding on. I felt myself being pulled in several directions at once, and I realized I was going to have to really hurt people. Then several grips disappeared with cries of chagrin. "Get going, Bob, I got this," Hugh yelled as he wrapped his arms around several more of our attackers. I realized he was deliberately taking on the whole group, and it was working. I was down to 2 or 3 holds, a few twists, a gut punch, and I was free. I grabbed a loose gun and stuck it in my mouth. It seemed like a waste of time since I'd had to get rid of the last one, but maybe I could figure something out. I dropped to all fours and sprinted down the nearest alley, determined to go right through anyone who got in my path. "Remember the failsafe, Hugh," I said over the intercom. "If it comes to that, Bob, but I may be able to talk my way out of this. Meanwhile, get Bender out of here." Talk his way out? I remembered my time with Natasha and company. More likely, he'd end up way too intimate with a sharp object. But I had to get to the station. I had a funny feeling that going straight west was going to involve dodging more Quinlans in masks. I glanced up, got my bearings, and adjusted my course to head for the hills. 28. Claiming Victory. Bill, September 2334, Vert. I gave a blat with the air horn, and the mass of bobs gradually quieted to a ragged rumble. There would be no total quiet, though, if I was reading this crowd right. Okay, a couple of reps from Starfleet will be here. I had to wait several mills for the insults and catcalls to die down. And we're going to hear them out. Then we'll ban-hammer them. Laughter greeted the last statement. I sent the text and Lenny popped in, flanked by a couple of other Starfleet members. The uniforms looked slightly different. I did a comparison with an earlier image and realized they'd toned down the TNG resemblance a bit. I wondered how much time and discussion had gone into that change. Now I got my silence. Not the respectful kind, but the kind where a crowd is sizing someone up. Lenny and friends felt it as well. They moved a little closer together. All right, Lenny. Let's make this quick. Lenny nodded to me. As a gesture of goodwill, we will release all remaining assets that are still under our control. We've accomplished what we set out to do. He was interrupted by laughter and jeers. Lenny took a moment to regroup, then continued. We'll be setting up our own version of BobNet, our own backup site, and so on. I get that there's no repairing this, and honestly, I don't see us wanting to continue the association anyway. We'll give you a star map of our territory. You stay on your side, we'll stay on ours. I waited a few moments for the latest round of jeers and insults to subside. Then I said, you haven't, won. I mean, you did some damage, but it won't have the effect you were hoping for. What you did wasn't a strategy. It was just lighting things on fire to watch them burn. Lenny frowned. We had an opportunity presented to us, and we had to make a choice. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than sitting around doing nothing except complaining at moots. Lenny looked directly into my eyes for a moment, and an unspoken message traveled between us. There was more to this. It had to do with the private conversation we'd had, and he wasn't going to bring it up if I didn't. After a brief moment of silence, Lenny waved a hand in dismissal. Anyway, it's done. No point in obsessing about it, and with that, he and his fellows vanished. That was kind of anticlimactic, Garfield said, as the background chatter increased to a shouting level. Yeah. Interesting. I frowned and turned away. This would take some more thought. 29. Dodging. Bob, September 2334, Garrick's Spine. I got almost an entire block before I picked up a new set of pursuers. 6 masked Quinlans turned and started after me as I ran past them. I heard the puff sound of tranq guns being fired, but oddly didn't feel any impacts or hear the ping of flechettes bouncing off things. How bad was their shooting anyway? I turned an eyeball to look behind me, trying desperately not to fall flat on my face from the dual images coming in. I handed off the running activity to the internal AMI for a moment and concentrated on the view to the rear. It would appear that the resistance was involved. 2 of the 6 Quinlans behind me were down on the ground, having been shot, and the other 4 were shooting back at something out of sight. I guess this was good to a certain extent, but in this case the enemy of my enemy was still my enemy. I wondered briefly how they managed to tell each other apart. But only briefly, and I didn't let it distract me from the serious business of getting the hell out of there. I hit the edge of town and ran into the forest without breaking stride. I didn't know what tracking options they'd have. I could lower my body temperature once I stopped generating heat from exertion. I could turn off my scent. I performed the action as soon as I thought of it. I couldn't camouflage myself, not like the drones, but I could blend in with the forest when I stopped moving. I was, after all, brown. I had to make my way to the station, but I didn't have to take the direct route. Did the Quinlans know or suspect that I couldn't go by water? If not, they'd have to guard the river and stream approaches as well. But I couldn't afford to stop moving near the town. If they formed a search cordon, they'd flush me out. And going into hiding wasn't to my advantage. I had to get out of Heaven's River. I kept up the pace as long as I could, but eventually my heads-up started flashing warnings about overheating. It was okay, though. I was several miles out of town by this point, and The Quinlans would take twice the time to catch up with me, even if they knew exactly where I was. I sat down, took the tranq gun out of my mouth, and began taking deep lungfuls of air. I didn't need the oxygen, but each breath carried away some waste heat. After a bit of fiddling, I found I could jam the gun into a webbing pocket on the side of the backpack. It wasn't ideal, but I didn't care at this point if someone saw that I was carrying a crew weapon. Time to take stock. Hugh, what's your situation? They've put me in manacles and commandeered a wagon. The hounds were groggy, but not unconscious. They're bellowing up a storm of protest, but doing what they're told. Where are you heading? Looks like the Eastern Station. I imagine I'll be going for a ride to meet someone. Okay, keep me updated. He would keep for a while. Bill, what's the situation? Just ended moot. We had a talk with Starfleet. It was unsatisfying, let's say. Resolved nothing. Wow, that must have been interesting. Kind of sorry I missed it. You can read the transcripts. Meanwhile, I've been bringing myself up to date on your blog. Bender still okay? Matrix still in one piece as far as I know. I just don't know how much jostling these things can take. It's not really part of the specs, you know? Yeah, got it, buddy. Well, take it easy. Hopefully we'll be able to talk later with a little less stress. And that was that. I didn't have an excuse to call Will or Howard, or even Marvin or Luke. With an internal sigh, I glanced at my heads up. Temps were down to something reasonable, although not yet baseline, but I could travel as long as I was relaxed about it. Time to go. The rest of the trip to the station was uneventful. I did half expect Quinlans to jump out from behind trees, especially as I got close, but Quinlans weren't forest creatures by nature. I imagined that being in the trees and away from water would make them nervous. Finally, I could see the transit station through a gap in the forest. With freedom this close, I had to fight an urge to just break into a run. In any case, I wouldn't be going in through the front door, or the maintenance door. Fortunately, I had the hatch that Gandalf had. A squad of Quinlans stood around the area of the hatch, holding shovels and discussing. Our secret entrance had been found. This was just getting worse and worse. I was literally a stone's throw from getting out, and every damned Quinlan on the planet had decided to show up here. But maybe they'd left the maintenance door open? Or maybe I could sneak in somehow. I didn't see any alternatives. Taking care to avoid rustling the foliage, I snuck around to the other side of the station. I arrived just as a Quinlan pressed her card against the reader and walked in through the maintenance door. I was too far to grab it before it closed, and anyway, that would be bad strategy until I knew more. But Quinlans were coming and going, and they had security cards. One way or another, I was going to make that work for me. I watched carefully, waiting for a moment when no one was in sight. I untangled the tranq gun from my pack, then crept up to the maintenance door. There was no discernible sound from the inside, but the wall construction was pretty thick. I might be able to peer through the front windows to see if anyone was in the lobby, and maybe, just maybe, I had enough fleas left to jimmy the lock. Without warning, the door burst open, and a gaggle of Quinlans poured out, tranq guns drawn. I stared at the guns pointed in my direction. Crew or resistance? At this point, it didn't matter. Both groups were after me. This bunch was standing between me and the way out, and I decided I had just about had it. This was the time for a brute force response. I could take flechettes in the chest without critical damage. Bender's matrix was shielded by my body, and I had a full magazine. I was simply going to keep shooting them until I was the last man standing. I straightened up, tranq gun held out before me, and advanced on the group. This caused some consternation as several of them glanced backward with one eye to see if they were being snuck up on, and the rest settled into firing positions. Then one of the Quinlans held up a hand and yelled, "Hold on!" He cupped the other over his ear. I wasn't sure if he was gesturing at me or at his comrades. Judging from the expressions on their faces, they weren't sure either. The whole situation was straight out of a comic book. The battle was on hold while someone answered the phone. And it was definitely some kind of communication device because the conversation was two-way. The Quinlan would talk, then listen, then talk. A couple of times he rolled his eyes. I realized I was in an untenable position strategically. While I stared at the guy on the phone, other Quinlans could be, "Oof," I said, as some number of Quinlans landed on me. I found myself face down on the ground, my arms and legs pinned by the weight of many bodies. My fault. A Quinlan would have used his mobile eyes to occasionally check for threats from behind. With my human background, I tended to look in one direction at a time. I fought back, but I was terrified that Bender might be damaged in the struggle. Interestingly, my attackers seemed to be just as concerned. Their attack concentrated on immobilizing my limbs rather than just dogpiling. Then my backpack disappeared. I rolled my eyes back, now that it was too late, to see a Quinlan with a knife in one hand and my backpack in the other, severed straps dangling. They had Bender. Escape was no longer an option. I stopped struggling. No one moved for several seconds. I think they were expecting me to wait for them to relax, then try something. Not unreasonable. But I had no intention of trying to get away without Bender. One Quinlan leaned down to place his face in my field of view.
"We have the backpack with the cube. You are only a secondary target. The cube will be going to the administrator with or without you. Do you understand?"
"Yes," I said with a grim tone. I wasn't about to volunteer any information about my motivations. I think they would assume that I'd grab Bender and run if given the chance. It didn't need to be discussed. The spokescritter gestured, and Quinlans began slowly removing themselves from the scrum. In moments, I was technically free. I stood and looked around. My backpack was nowhere in sight. About a dozen Quinlans surrounded me, all poised to jump me again if I acted up. "So what now?" I said. The leader pointed to the station door that until a few minutes ago I had desperately wanted to get through.
"The cube will be traveling separately to ensure that you don't try anything."
I felt ill. I'd lost. 4,000 miles of dodging, only to get caught at the finish line. Then I lifted my chin. It wasn't over. They couldn't actually kill me, and we'd be back, in numbers, with enough scanners to cover the entire Topopolis, if necessary, unless they actually disassembled the Matrix. Not bothering with a response, I marched toward the maintenance door. I would cooperate. I would even attempt to negotiate with the administrator, but if they refused to give up Bender, they were looking at a long, drawn-out guerrilla war, and that was best case. I tried to pay attention as we marched to the train platform, but my thoughts were dark and directed inward. I barely noticed as the leader called for a train, and I didn't bother to listen for the requested destination. In seconds, the train door whooshed open, and we boarded. The Quinlan crew continued to surround me, but they realized I wasn't going to make a dash for it as long as they had Bender. We all took seats, and the train pulled smoothly away from the station. The leader, who had sat beside me, turned once acceleration was over.
"Can you tell me why you want the cube so badly?"
I didn't see any point in lying. And the truth might be more helpful. It's a friend of mine. And a relative. He cocked his head, a very human-looking expression.
"I don't see the resemblance."
"You know that the administrator is not a Quinlan, right?" I replied. He nodded, and I continued. "So intelligent beings don't have to be flesh and blood." He frowned, silent for several moments.
"It does explain your single-mindedness."
He got up and walked to the other end of the car. I could see that he was talking into whatever comms system he was wearing, no doubt reporting the results of our conversation. Whether that would help or hurt my cause was unknown. The trip was surprisingly short. Then we trooped along the standard station corridor. I realized quickly that this was a segment mountain complex rather than a public station. That made sense. We'd come back to a crew's stronghold. They brought me to what I suppose could be called a conference room. It had a table and chairs anyway. In the middle of the table was a device that at first glance resembled a much more modern version of Motorola.
"We're here,"
the leader said into the air as we sat.
"Acknowledged,"
the device replied. So, Motorola confirmed. "Are you the administrator?" I asked.
"I am. You may refer to me as Anak. I have some questions for you."
"I want my friend back."
"An answer to a question not asked, and tritely obvious given the energy you've put into avoiding us."
"This is not negotiable." I was mad now. I knew it, and I realized I might screw things up. I tried to rein it in.
"This is not a negotiation, so the statement is irrelevant." Pause. "I am currently speaking with your partner, Hugh. I will compare your responses. Untruths will not be tolerated. Consequences will be significant. Remember that I possess your cube."
Well, that was a clear threat. I briefly considered a counter-threat, but I was pretty sure that such a response would just lead to a death spiral. Still, best to check with Hugh first. "Hugh, have you told any whoppers?" "Nope. Stick to the truth. Trust me, Bob. This will work out." That at least made things a little easier. "Proceed," I said out loud. Anak spent several minutes grilling me on fairly innocuous points. He was obviously just confirming the story Hugh had given him. Finally, though, the questioning got around to the important things.
"You are an interstellar species?"
The word species is not really accurate, I replied. But if you're asking if we have interstellar travel, then yes.
"You have colonies in multiple systems?"
I considered whether I should clarify the difference between humans and Bobs and between colonies and orbiting spacecraft, but if I understood what he was digging for, it was probably an irrelevant distinction. "Yes."
"You are artificial intelligences?"
"We are replicants, copies of the minds of formerly living beings."
"The cube as well?"
"Yes." No response. As the silence became more drawn out, I could see my Quinlan escort getting nervous. They hadn't said a word through the entire exchange, but now began to mutter to each other. I wasn't sure if it was my story or the fact that Anak had lapsed into silence, but something was freaking them out. The silence from Anak continued for several minutes until the group leader finally got up and moved to the other end of the room. He held a hand to his ear and muttered into his communicator, then returned to his seat, a bemused expression on his face.
"You've stirred up a LaRouche nest of some kind," he said to me. "Anak basically told me to shut up and wait for orders."
Despite the situation, despite my fear for Bender, I had to laugh. I think that's my superpower.
"Do you need food? Facilities?"
he said. I shook my head. "I'm good, but if you want to lock me in a room for a while, I'm okay with that." I was sitting in my lazy boy mainlining my 4th or 5th coffee when my Manny forwarded an audio stream of the group leader's voice.
"Time to get up. Anak is back."
I quickly reconnected with my Manny, the leader who had introduced himself as Norm before they locked me in this room was standing in the open door. I stood up quickly. "Showtime." Norm frowned.
"Some of the things you say don't make sense, but I guess that's no surprise if you're not even Quinlan."
"Norm, if we'd had enough time to complete our survey before starting this expedition, I wouldn't even be saying weird things, but some of our expressions are getting translated literally." He shrugged, plainly not all that interested. Soon we found ourselves back in the conference room. My eyes grew wide as I walked in and saw Hugh sitting in one of the chairs. "Hey, Bob." "Hugh?" I tried to keep a straight face, but I was having trouble deciding if this was a good or bad thing. "Have they been torturing you?" He snickered. "Sort of, if you mean like my PhD oral defense. Original Bob's." I laughed. "Yeah, I know. I remember, too. I've never sweated so much before or since." I turned to Norm. "So what now?"
Hell, I don't know. I just work here.
Both Hugh and I chuckled in synchrony. Another universal. Norm put his hand to his ear. It seemed likely we were about to get an answer. He nodded several times, said,
Got it.
and tapped his ear. Then he looked up at us.
Looks like you're going home.